Hello, everyone. I'm Victor Fett, along with my co-host, our program producer, Professor Larry Ferre. We're at Marshall University, West Virginia. We host a weekly discussion panel, MUkraine, on Russia's war in Ukraine, with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use this chat to post questions for our guests. Today, I am honored to welcome back our previous guest, Professor Ilya Somin from George Mason University in Virginia, with a highly important discussion on Putin's Western supporters. Please, Ilya, microphone is yours. Introduce yourself and proceed. Thank you. The rest of us, please turn off our cameras during the talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Fett, for hosting me and all of you for watching. Today, I'm going to be talking about the topic of Putin's Western sympathizers, people in the Western world who either actively like and support Putin or what I refer to as the anti-anti-Putinists, people who don't necessarily like Putin and his government, but they're against opposing it too much. And I'll start off by talking a little about the contrast between the current situation and the Western supporters of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Most obviously, the Western supporters of the Soviet Union were almost entirely on the political left. Today, the situation is almost totally the opposite. Most of Putin's Western supporters are people on the political right, and I'll talk about why that is. I'll also go on to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the Putinist, or in some ways, really the nationalist opponents of Western liberalism, and they are quite different than the strengths and weaknesses of the communist opponents during the era of the Cold War. I'll also discuss briefly the contrast between the situation with Putin and that with China, the other major big anti-Western power in the world today. China has much less in the way of Western right-wing sympathizers than Russia does, and I'll talk a little about why that is and what can be learned from it. Finally, I'll talk briefly about some possible strategies for reducing support for Putin in the West and how it relates to our political situation more generally. Not all of this is about Putin as such. Some of it is about the internal politics of the United States and other Western nations. So let's start just by thinking about the Western supporters of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and how things worked in that period. Paul Hollander, a sociologist, has a great book called Political Pilgrims, which is about all the Western intellectuals who admired the Soviet Union and other communist regimes during that era. And there's quite a lot of them. People like Sartre, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and many others. Many of these people actually actively supported the communist regime and liked it. Examples include Lincoln Stevens, Paul Robeson, the Webbs, and many others. But there was a larger group of anti-communists. That is, people who didn't necessarily like the Soviet Union or admire it, but they were opposed to any measures taken against it, or at least ones that went beyond a very limited degree. And this anti-communist camp was actually in some ways more politically influential than outright pro-communists were. What did these people have in common? Almost all of them were on the political left in the West. They were socialists or communists, or at the very least, very left-wing liberals. And it's not hard to understand why. Soviet propaganda and the Soviet regime and its ideology generally mostly appealed to the Western left, and they did so in several different ways. One is, of course, they promoted the idea of economic equality and helping the working class increase its power and its wealth and situation. Does the slogan "Workers of the World Unite"? In addition, they promoted egalitarianism more generally, racial equality, which they contrasted with the prejudice and bigotry that existed in many Western nations, including the US. Gender equality, the Soviet government from early on, at least officially proclaimed that they were for equality between men and women, and tried to contrast that with the sexism that existed in the West. And finally, also anti-colonialism. The Soviet Union posed as the champion of the oppressed colonial people of the world who were oppressed by Western colonialists. A lot of these appeals were in some ways hypocritical. Obviously, the Soviet Union itself engaged in racial and ethnic discrimination and in imperialism and so forth. But nonetheless, these appeals had a lot of influence on the Western left, and many Western leftists, for sort of obvious reasons, liked it. Even those who did not fully buy all of the Soviet propaganda or did not like the Soviet Union, if they were on the left, they thought of the Soviet Union as at least in some ways a kindred spirit, even if a misguided one. And therefore, those who were anti-communist, they didn't want to go too far in opposing the Soviet Union. Now, I should emphasize that not all Western leftists were pro-Soviet or even anti-communist during this period. There were a good many Western liberals who did advocate a strong line against the Soviet Union. Examples in the US included Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Senator Henry Jackson, and quite a few others. But nonetheless, to the extent that the Soviet Union did have Western sympathizers, they were overwhelmingly on the political left. And the short explanation for that is that, of course, the official ideology of the Soviet Union itself was left-wing, and Soviet propaganda appealed mostly to Western leftists. When Western right-wingers were exposed to it, they didn't see very much that they could like. By contrast, the situation with Putin today is very different. If you look at the Western sympathizers of Putin's regime, they are overwhelmingly people on the political right. A striking recent example is Tucker Carlson with his visit to Moscow and his fawning over Vladimir Putin and talking about how wonderful Russian supermarkets are and other things of this sort. Carlson is, of course, a prominent nationalist right-winger in the West. If you look at the European government in the West that is most sympathetic to Putin, it is the right-wing regime of Viktor Orban in Hungary. More generally, if you look at right-wing political parties and movements in Europe, some of them are clearly sympathetic to Putin in various ways. The AfD in Germany, the main right-wing party in France, which used to be called the National Front, and its supporters, and there are other examples in other countries as well. Here, just as during the Cold War, there were people who were sympathetic to communism, and there were also the anti-communists. We have what I would call people who actually like Putin and his government, like Tucker Carlson clearly does, and people who are more anti-Putinists. They don't necessarily like Putin's government. If pressed, they will admit that Putin is an oppressive dictator, but they nonetheless don't want to take any significant action against him because just as anti-communists thought of the Soviet Union as in some ways a kindred spirit, even though misguided, so many Western right-wingers who don't fully like Putin's regime, they nonetheless see it as a kind of kindred spirit. You see that with a large portion of the Republican Party in the United States and with some right-wingers in European countries as well. Most of these people don't necessarily love every aspect of Putin and his government, but they don't want to do too much to oppose it because they see commonalities between themselves and Putin's regime. Now, I should note that Putin does have some left-wing supporters in the United States and in Western Europe, but you have to go very, very far to the left before you can find them. Most of these are people who are so anti-American, they hate the United States and the Western alliance so much that they're willing to support virtually any power that seems to also be anti-American. So examples include Noam Chomsky in the United States. Cornel West is another American example. There are a few in Europe as well. But overall, most of the Western left Even the socialist left is not with them. Consider the case of Bernie Sanders in the United States. Senator Sanders is probably the most prominent mainstream far leftist in the US, who's prominent in mainstream American politics. He has been a strong supporter of aiding Ukraine against Russia, even though during the Cold War, he was at the very least an anti-communist, and in some cases, he actually verged into pro-communism. So just as Western right-wingers, some of them are now more sympathetic to Russia in this era. There are some types of Western left-wingers who had some sympathy with the Soviet Union, but definitely do not with respect to today's Russia. So why the difference? If you look at Putin's appeal and Putin's ideology, you see major right-wing elements. The biggest, of course, is nationalism. While the ideology of the Soviet Union is communism, the ideology of Putin's regime is Russian nationalism. Nationalism, as I use the term here, is the idea that government should serve the interests of a particular ethnic or cultural group, and should use coercion when necessary to suppress opposing groups, to suppress threats to that group's culture, and to increase that group's power. And so Russian nationalists, like Western nationalists, tend to be opposed to liberalism, what they call globalism. They tend to be hostile to immigration, and they also have a significant social conservative element. So it is not an accident that Putin, both domestically and in his appeals to supporters abroad, is very anti-gay and lesbian. He's also very much against transgenderism, and he likes to talk about how, well, in the West, they no longer understand the difference between men and women. And this kind of rhetoric resonates with at least some types of Western right-wingers, specifically those who are nationalistic and those who are strongly socially conservative. So if you look at right-wing political movements and parties in the West, it's notable that the ones that tend to be sympathetic to Putin are also those that tend to be nationalistic and very socially conservative. A large part of the Republican Party in the US right now is clearly like that, including Donald Trump, who has moved the Republicans in the US from being a more conventionally conservative party to being a big government right-wing nationalist party. Similarly, nationalist parties in France and Germany and Orban's movement in Hungary and others also tend to be sympathetic to Putin for these reasons. On the other hand, in countries where the dominant conservative party is not especially nationalistic or socially conservative, you see much less support for Putin and much more support for Ukraine. Examples include the Canadian Conservatives, those in Australia and New Zealand, also to a large extent the British Conservative Party, and there are some other cases like this as well. I should note also there are cases where right-wing nationalist parties in the West are anti-Russian because nationalist movements in that country have a long history of hostility with Russia. Poland is an excellent example. The right-wing nationalist government that was in power in Poland until very recently was nonetheless strong, mostly supportive of Ukraine and hostile to Russia. Why? Because Polish nationalists and Russian nationalists have a very obvious history of conflict. There are some exceptions to this pattern. Perhaps also, it's not easy for me to explain what's going on in Italy, where the new government of Meloni is in some ways a right-wing nationalist government, but Giorgia Meloni nonetheless is very supportive of Ukraine and anti-Putin. I have to admit, I'm not sure I'm expert enough in Italian politics to fully explain that, but it's an interesting anomaly that we can perhaps talk about in the questions. Finally, there is an additional appeal that Putin has that is the image of strength that he tries to project. Right-wing nationalists, and in some cases social conservatives, like the idea of a strong and powerful government that projects strength and manly virtues. They're suspicious of more feminine-seeming rulers and governments, and Putin's regime tries very hard to project a macho image of strength, even to the extent of producing those famous videos where Putin is doing judo, or he's hunting tigers, or he's lifting weights, and things like that. There are obvious parallels parallels here with previous right-wing Western nationalist sympathy for fascism in the 1920s and 30s. Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco, they also tried hard to project an image of strength. They were opposed to Western liberalism, or what today would be called globalism, and they also had a strong socially conservative element as well, and they too had many Western admirers in the 1920s and 30s. And if you go back and look who those people were, they were in many cases some of the same kinds of people and movements that tend to be sympathetic to Putin today. So I'd like next to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of today's nationalist opponents of liberalism and their Western sympathizers compared to that of the communist era. It has to be admitted that the right-wing nationalist ideology that Putin espouses, it does have some appeal. Not to me necessarily, certainly I hate it, but it does have some appeal to a lot of people. One reason why it does is that many people instinctively have the image in their mind that the world is a zero-sum game. The only way my group can benefit is at the expense of other groups or vice versa. This is why many nationalists, they're anti-immigration, they're anti-trade, they're for protectionism. They feel that their group can only become wealthy and successful in competition with other groups. Second, and even more fundamental, in human psychology, we have what scholars call an in-group, out-group dynamic, a certain suspicion of outsiders. This is ingrained in our psychology going all the way back to Stone Age man, where Stone Age people were suspicious of people who were from outside their particular band, and nationalism very much appeals to this. And there is the sense that you need to be strong and powerful in order to deter the outsiders, in order to deal with them. Finally, the socially conservative aspect of Putin's ideology also appeals to a lot of people. There's a lot of people in different countries who are uncomfortable with things like changes in gender roles that have occurred, the growing acceptance of gays and lesbians, and so forth. And Putin appeals to these traditionalists in various ways. But if Putinism and the nationalism of which it is one example have their strengths, they also have weaknesses. One is that if you look back at communism and you look to see who it most appealed to in the West, communism tended to appeal to the knowledgeable and the highly educated. While the slogan was "Workers of the world unite," it was really more intellectuals than workers that tended to like Soviet communism and to respond to its appeal. By contrast, nationalism, as survey data shows, it tends to appeal to the less educated and the less knowledgeable. And other things equal, less educated and less knowledgeable people have somewhat less influence and less capability to affect political change. Moreover, the result of nationalism's appeal to the more ignorant and less educated is that the more educated and knowledgeable people in their own society often become alienated from the government to the extent that many of them flee abroad. Since the war in Ukraine began, over 1 million Russians have fled abroad. They're disproportionately the highly educated and skilled. Putin's regime loses that asset, and we can potentially gain it if we would let more of them in. And so this is a potential resource for us and a weakness for them. Another weakness of nationalism is that it is inherently divisive. Say what you will about the slogan, "Workers of the world unite," it has to be admitted that it makes a certain amount of sense. Workers of every race, country, nationality, religion, or whatnot could all potentially understand the idea that they had a common interest in combating capitalists. And similarly, intellectuals around the world, regardless of their race or ethnicity or culture, they could potentially be inspired by socialist ideas or by the idea of creating a new socialist man that would put capitalism behind him and would be less selfish and more happy and fulfilled. On the other hand, it's much harder to argue that what we want is nationalists of the world to unite, because nationalists of one country have obvious conflicts and divergences of interest with nationalists from other countries. I mentioned before the historic conflict between Polish nationalists and Russian nationalists, but this point can be generalized that French, German nationalists, for instance, they have conflicts among themselves, but also have reason to be suspicious of Russian nationalists as well. So this is a source of division that we can exploit. We can potentially point out to Western nationalists that Russian nationalists do not actually have common interests with them, and that the expansion of Russian power is not really a good thing from the standpoint of, say, a French nationalist, a German nationalist, a Hungarian nationalist, and so on. I mentioned earlier the image of strength that Putin and other nationalist movements try to project. And when they successfully project it, this can be an asset to them. But there is a flip side. The flip side is that image is easily punctured if the movement suffers a devastating military defeat. Look at what happened to the Nazis and the fascists of the 1930s and 40s. When they got crushed during World War II, their movement never recovered. Why? Because the image of strength in people's minds was totally wiped out. Another more recent example is Arab nationalism in the 1960s and 70s. For a time, it had enormous appeal in the Arab world. But when its main supporter, when its main advocate, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the dictator of Egypt, when he got crushed in the Six-Day War with Israel, that drained the ideology of a lot of its appeal. It has never fully recovered, even to this day. So many movements can be undermined by defeats in war, but nationalism is particularly vulnerable to this because it depends so much on projecting an image of strength. Some of what I've said about Russia and Putin and its appeal in the West is reinforced by the contrast with the other big anti-Western power in the world today, which is China. The Chinese regime currently is also quite nationalistic. It's quite hostile to the West, and yet it has much less in the way of Western right-wing support and sympathy than Putin and Russia do. And it's interesting to ask why that is. One reason, perhaps, is that China is still ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore many Western right-wingers may still view it as a left-wing regime, even though currently and for some time, the Chinese government has been promoting nationalism far more than communism. You rarely see them talk about class struggle or equality or the like, and you do see them talk a lot about national sovereignty and Chinese culture, and so on. A second reason why China has less Western right-wing sympathy is because Western right-wingers, many of them view China as more culturally and racially different from the West than Russia is. To take the most obvious point, Russia is perceived as a white Christian nation. It actually is not completely white. I totally understand there's a large Muslim minority. There are many non-whites, but Western rightists who like Russia, they tend to perceive it as a white Christian nation. By contrast, China is not Christian, and obviously Chinese are not white either, and that makes Western nationalists view them with greater suspicion. Finally, although I'm not an expert on this, it seems to me that Chinese propaganda is less oriented towards Western right-wingers than the Russian version is. Much of what China puts out still seems in the old, more Cold War-like mode of appealing to Western left-wingers, and therefore what they have done has not resonated with the Western right as much. I don't want to overstate the contrast. There are actually some Western right-wingers who like China. Sohrab Ahmari, one of the leaders of the so-called national conservative movement in the United States, he actually has spoken of his admiration for the Chinese government. And there are a few other examples, but there are not many, and certainly not nearly as many as there are Western sympathizers with Putin. So finally, what is to be done about this situation? I would be lying if I said I had a complete and carefully worked out program for how it should be done. And I should also emphasize that It may be that the situation in different countries is different. So the right approach for the US may not be the right approach for Germany or France or other countries. Nonetheless, I think there are a few general points that are worth keeping in mind, even though they don't provide a comprehensive solution. First, we should work to fight nationalism in our own societies because nationalism is a harmful ideology and very dangerous, even entirely aside from the idea that it might help Vladimir Putin. If you're interested in the reasons why nationalism is harmful and dangerous, I have an article that I recently published in National Affairs, co-authored with Alex Nowrasteh, which is called The Case Against Nationalism. We're going to put it up in the links to this video when it gets posted. Nationalism is highly oppressive, and it also tends to lead to economic policies that impoverish people and cause great harm. Indeed, in this respect, it's actually similar to socialism. It leads to more government control over the economy and also therefore creates poverty and oppression. We should also, both at home and abroad, work hard to promote universal liberal values of liberty and equality. Historically, those have been very successful in undermining racism, ethnic prejudice, sexism, and the like within Western society. We haven't gotten rid of those things entirely, but by spreading and promoting universal liberal values, we have greatly reduced them. It's a method that has proven to work, and it can work internationally as well. Many countries that have a long history of being oppressive dictatorships have, through adopting Western liberal or universal liberal values, have made a major shift. Good examples include Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and many others. We can promote that appeal in Russia and China as well. There's no good reason to think that Chinese and Russians are inherently averse to such things. Indeed, just look at all the Russians who historically have wanted to flee oppressive Russian regimes in order to get the benefits of living under more liberal governments. Finally, I talked about the image of strength and how that could be punctured by defeat in war. The obvious implication here is that the appeal of Putin's regime can be greatly reduced, both in Russia and in the West, if we inflict a crushing defeat on it in Ukraine. Therefore, even aside from all the other reasons to back Ukraine against Russia, strategic reasons, moral and humanitarian reasons, and so forth, we can weaken Putin's regime and its appeal both in Russia and in the West by inflicting the maximum possible military defeat upon it. This is not my view alone. Most Russian liberal oppositionists also say much the same thing. Yulia Navalny, the widow of Alexei Navalny, the leading Russian opposition figure who recently was murdered by Putin in prison, she just recently published an article in the Washington Post where, among other things, she urges the West to back Ukraine more fully because that will help undermine Putin's regime in Russia, and that would it would help undermine the appeal of that regime abroad as well. Western right-wingers don't like losers. If Putin looks like a loser, he will have less appeal to them, and he will have less appeal in Russia as well. Much more can perhaps be said, but for the moment, I'm going to stop, and I look forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you very much for the insights and very rounded view to these many problems. I open the discussion to our live regular viewers, please. I see several people today. Questions or comments, please. Dr. McAllister, open yourself.
You got me?
Yes.
Okay. Gosh, that was a great presentation. These are a lot of things that I've been thinking an awful lot about. One of the things I think that makes this so dangerous in America is that there are historical echoes, that it's falling on ground. This nationalist message has been powerful in America in the past, whereas when you talked about in the 1930s and the people that were supported communism, that was always more of an intellectual movement. And that wasn't one that had a whole lot of mass appeal. But If you go back to the 1920s, we had this really powerful anti-immigration movement that led to the National Origins Act of 1924, that the eugenics movement, Madison Grant and the passing of the Great Race, that has been a powerful move, or powerful movement in the past in American history. Even into the 1930s, there was a remarkable amount of support for what was happening in Nazi Germany, with Father Charles Coughlin and even American members of Congress who cooperated with Nazi propaganda, 24 of them, in fact. So that's what's frightened me, is that there are historical echoes. And the other thing that strikes me is that this is not just an American or European or Russian thing. We can actually see echoes of this in India, in other places with Modi and the Modi government and promotion of Hindu nationalism. We can see it with the Muslim Brotherhood and the promotion of Muslim religious nationalism. It feels like kind of a worldwide movement. And Putin, I think, is the face of it, because I think he's seeding a lot of those movements, especially in Europe, where he has been very actively involved in supporting those parties. I just wonder if you have any reaction to that.
So I think it's definitely true that there are parallels with, the situation of 100 years ago in 1920s and 30s. I mentioned some of them. You've mentioned some others. It is also true that this is not limited to the West. There are obviously nationalist movements in the third world, some of which are sympathetic to Putin, others not, but they do exist. And, there's some issues there. I do think it would be a mistake to say, well, all these movements are just a product of like Russian subversion or Russian propaganda and so forth. Russian propaganda, it does help them at the margin, but in the US and in Europe and elsewhere, most of the propaganda and appeal of these movements is homegrown. Maybe Putin's efforts help Trump slightly at the margin, but it's pretty obvious that Trump does have a significant domestic political base. And even if Putin stopped all of his efforts to involve himself in US politics tomorrow, Trump's support would probably be only very slightly less. So there are sort of important homegrown elements to this. And there's a broader issue of how to combat these sorts of movements, even aside from Putin, which are to some extent outside the scope of this talk. I do think when we talk about religious movements, they're like with the radical Islamists, there's some complexity in that in some ways, radical Islamism is more like communism than it is like nationalism, in that, in principle at least, anybody of any race or background can become a Muslim and accept the ideology of ISIS or Hamas or whatnot. And so therefore it has a kind of universalist element that nationalism does not have, although there are cases where Islam, like Christianity or Judaism, can sometimes be tied to a particular ethnic or racial group, just like Russian Orthodoxy has become bound up, with Russian nationalism, even though Christianity more generally is clearly a universalistic regime. So when we look at movements around the world, the dividing line between nationalistic and universalist ideologies is not always completely a clean one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you, Dr. McAllister. Our co-moderator, producer Larry, please, you have your hand on.
Hi, Ilya. What a great presentation. Thank you. I'll tell you, okay, I'm conservative, okay, and I fully support supporting Ukraine and militarily and the like, although much of what I've been involved with is simply raising money for refugees. Bob McAllister too, he's been involved with that. But there's a few things that I'm curious as to how you would explain this. You would distinguish between nationalism and patriotism, because I would consider myself a patriot, and yet the way you describe nationalism, I wouldn't consider myself a nationalist that way. For instance, I believe all groups should be free. Everyone should have freedom of speech, for instance. And even when Tucker Carlson was asked if he liked Russia and stuff and Putin, he said, well, he said if he lived in Russia, he would have been killed long ago because of things he said. So he said no. So, I think maybe he was misunderstood a little bit too. And yet I don't really know where he stands. I don't know where a lot of conservatives stand. It seems like they're trying to find their way. But I'm just, to begin with, how would you describe the difference between patriotism and nationalism?
So it's an interesting question. Patriotism and nationalism, like a lot of political terms, can be very imprecise and have different meanings to different people. The same problem bedevils terms like conservatism, right and left, socialism, even libertarianism. I'm a libertarian, but there are people who mean different things by that than I do. And so there are people who call themselves libertarians who I think are really not. And there are people who would say, well, I'm not a real libertarian, even though I say that I am one. So for purposes of this talk, I would distinguish in the following way: that nationalism, as I have defined it here, is the idea that the government of a nation should serve the interests of a particular ethnic or cultural group, like the ethnically French in France, the Russians in Russia, the Germans in Germany, and so forth, and whatever you think the real Americans are in the United States, which for many American nationalists would be some form of white Christian people. On the other hand, patriotism could be support for your country generally, but that support could take various different forms. In the United States, it could even take the form of supporting Enlightenment liberalism, which is sort of the ideology on which America was historically founded. And another country, it might take a different form. So for this talk, that's how I would define it. But I recognize that different people use those words in different ways. And I wish we had better and more precise terminology, but I chose to use the term nationalism because any other words that I use would either also be very imprecise, or I would have to invent a whole new terminology, and then I would have to devote a lot of the talk to explaining the new terminology, and people would be bored to tears by the time I finished. Thank you also for your work with respect to refugees. I too have been involved in that, and in fact, my previous talk to the Marshall Ukraine program was actually about Ukrainian and Russian refugees from the war and policies adopted in respect to that issue.
I'd like to ask you another question, if I may, if there's no other ones, people wanting to ask questions. When Obama was asked to help arm Ukraine, of course he didn't. He wouldn't allow any weaponry in. When Trump became president, he allowed weaponry in, Stinger and Javelins missiles, which I don't think Kyiv would have been able to resist being taken over without that weaponry. The other thing, Obama supported the expansion of Nord Stream gas to Germany, and President Trump was very much against that. He thought that it would make Europe more dependent on Russia, which was very dangerous to do. So, and yet now I'm not sure where Trump would stand. He seemed very supportive, whereas, President Biden started up Nord Stream right away, like I think the day he became president or the next day. And yet now I don't know. I really don't know where Trump stands on this issue as far as supporting Ukraine. And I think a lot of it has to do with just securing the southern border. I think, and what do you think about this? That if we return to end of catch and release, if we ended catch and release, and if we resumed reside in Mexico, I think that would take away a lot of the opposition to military aid to Ukraine. But what do you think?
So there's several different questions there. Let me take them in reverse order. First, I write a lot about immigration policy, and the whole linkage between the southern border and Ukraine is utterly bogus, both in terms of as a matter of policy and even as a sort of political matter. As a matter of policy, there's just simply no comparison between migrants seeking freedom and opportunity and a massive Russian army invading Ukraine and slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people. Yes, you can try to call both these things invasion, but that just shows the slipperiness of words. It doesn't actually make them so the same thing. Second, from a political point of view, it's worth noting why it is that Republicans in Congress started linking these two issues. It's not because there's an inherent logical connection between them. It's that when they voted on Ukraine separately, that was an issue that divided the Republican Party, with the more nationalistic and Trumpist conservatives voting against aid to Ukraine versus the more traditional ones like Senator Mitch McConnell voting for it. So Republicans in Congress said, if we could link together the border issue, which the nationalist types really like and care about, with the Ukraine issue, then we can sort of unify our party. And for a while that seemed to work. And the Langford bill that was put together that combined these things, might have succeeded in reuniting the party. But then Donald Trump came along and said, no, I oppose this thing. I'm going to blow it up. And most Republicans in the House followed him because he is the leader of the party. And therefore, it is simply not the case that these things are sort of logically linked, or that people, that smart, knowledgeable people genuinely believe that you can't do the one without the other. It's that a linkage was created by Republican leaders in Congress, I think, for the purpose of solving an internal problem within the Republican caucus in that institution. And then they didn't expect Trump to blow up the deal that they had struck. Now, the second issue here is what does Trump himself think about Ukraine? Yeah, he did give Ukraine a little bit more military aid, not nearly enough, but he did give them some. On the other hand, he also tried to use that aid as leverage to try to get Zelensky to find dirt on Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. He also, more generally, throughout his presidency, did everything he could to undermine the Western alliance, pick trade wars with our allies, raise doubts about whether he would support NATO. And currently, he has been pretty clear in saying that he would want to cut support for Ukraine. It's always possible that he would shift his position if he sees some benefit to himself in doing so. We can't be 100% certain, but I think it seems very likely that Trump is much more anti-Ukraine than not, and also that Trump. And in this respect, he's not idiosyncratic. A lot of nationalist conservatives in the West are like this, that he admires the image of strength that Putin projects. He called his invasion of Ukraine genius, and so forth. And so while some of Trump's behavior is a matter of his idiosyncrasies and his personal obsessions and the like, some of it links up to this broader nationalistic ideology, which he has elements of, not because he's carefully thought it out and he has a well worked out intellectual theory of it, but because nationalism appeals to these kinds of primordial instincts that I mentioned earlier, and Trump is an example of the kind of person it appeals to. And he has actually a history going back several decades of viewing the world as a zero-sum game, of being suspicious of people of other backgrounds and ethnicities and so forth. And therefore, he is the kind of less knowledgeable person to whom nationalist ideology tends to appeal. And more importantly, the movement that he leads is like that, and has that as a strong element. Finally, there is a separate issue as to why Obama and Biden and actually more Obama than Biden in this case, were unwilling to oppose Russia more strongly after 2014. They did condemn what Russia did. They did impose some sanctions, but didn't go as far as they should have. There is a history there of sort of the geostrategy of the political left in the US and to some extent in Europe as well. Importantly, however, there was never a sense that Western leftists liked Putin and his ideology or in his regime. The debate there was not about, is Putin good or bad, but rather could perhaps Russia be accommodated in less destructive ways. And also there was a debate about whether dealing with them was worth the trouble. And finally, there was a debate about, is Ukraine capable of standing up to Russia even with Western aid? Ukraine's military performance in the war turned out to be much better than many Western experts experts expected. And those are all issues that I know probably have been discussed in other Marshall podcasts, and I'm not an expert on some of them myself. So I'm not here to defend everything that Obama did or everything that Biden has done. We could have a whole separate discussion about the Western left and their approach towards Putin. But one thing that is obvious is that the Western left does not have the same kind of divided feelings about Putin that they had about the Soviet Union. The main divisions there, except for some on the far left, are over matters of tactics and some matters of strategy, rather than over sort of general matters of whether Putin is the kind of force that we should be sympathetic to or in opposition to. So that was a long answer, but there were several different issues raised by that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilya. Thank you, Larry, for candid discussion. I see no more hands lifted, but if people think about something else, well, I have my question. We veered away from Putin to American issues, which is important, of course, very important. But I must remind whoever will be watching that this weekend is so-called Russian election, which most independent observers would not even dare to call election because we expect it to be a sham. But sham doesn't mean that 100% of this voting will be frauded. My question to you, Ilya, is how do you see this situation? We keep saying Putin's war and Putin's regime, but all regimes depend on their populace. We know that Russian population is scared and passive, but what is your take on this? How much of this vote will be genuine vote for Putin?
So that is a good question that I don't know that I can provide any kind of definitive answer, because it goes to this deeper issue of how much support does Putin actually have within Russia? And there's a large scholarly literature on the question of authoritarian regimes and how much support they really have from their population. I particularly recommend a great book by Timur Kuran called Private Truths, Public Lies, where Kuran, who's a well-known economist at Duke University, he talks about how under a repressive regime like Putin's, but also other examples, there's strong incentives to engage in what he calls preference falsification. That is, even if you don't really like the authoritarian government, there's an incentive not to speak out against it because you might end up in prison or dead, like just happened with Alexei Navalny, and it's also happened with Vladimir Kara-Murza and Ilya Yashin and a number of other Russian opposition leaders. So there's an incentive to falsify your views, to pretend you support the regime, even if you don't, or at least to not speak out against it. Even if you don't end up in prison, lesser sanctions can still deter a lot of people. Imagine you're a professor like me. Maybe if you started speaking out against Putin, all that would happen is you would just lose your job and you wouldn't necessarily go to prison. But that itself is terrible. You go from being a professor to perhaps, packing groceries in a supermarket or something. That's a terrible fall in your status and income and in your lifestyle. And many people, that even something like that is enough to deter them, never mind being killed or in prison. And in Russia right now, you can get as much as 15 years in prison, even for something like publicly referring to the war in Ukraine as a war, as opposed to a special military operation, which is the official Kremlin euphemism for this. So there's a chance that there is a lot of Russians who actually do oppose the regime but are afraid to speak out. We saw a little bit of this when there were the memorial services for Navalny after he died. Thousands of people came, even though they knew they were being observed by the police and there might be sanctions against them. And some of them, when they spoke out, they said, well, I know other people who wanted to come, but they didn't because they were afraid. So there's probably, for each person who came, there's probably a good many others who didn't come because they were scared. At the same time, though, we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that nobody supports Putin except for a small clique of elites. There very likely are a lot of Russians, particularly less educated, more rural ones, more traditional ones, who do support Putin for various reasons because of the nationalist ideology and its appeal that I mentioned earlier, because they think that Putin, to borrow a phrase for Donald Trump, they may think that Putin is making Russia great again and is rebuilding its power. And so The short answer is I think we don't really know how much support Putin has because there are many people who have incentives to falsify or to hide their true views. And we do know, however, that regimes like this, often a lot of their support falls away if they suffer big defeats on the battlefield. That has happened before in Russian history and in the history of other authoritarian regimes. And so that's something useful to keep in mind. I think also, and this goes beyond the scope of this talk, but the West can do more to appeal to people within Russia who are not sympathetic to Putin. We can learn from some of our successes during the Cold War in that respect. And some of that is translatable here, even though obviously the ideological appeal of the current Russian government, both within Russia and outside of Russia, is somewhat different than that of the communist regime. I'll mention one last point, and that is that although, as I said before, many Western right-wingers see Russia as a white Christian power, there are actually important ethnic minorities in Russia. They're deeply aggrieved, many of them, and they're groups that we can appeal to. We saw recently the riots in Bashkortostan, and there are other examples like this. If you are if you are a Buryat or a native of the Caucasus or whatnot, Putin's Russian nationalism is unlikely to appeal to you very much, and it especially won't appeal to you when you and your group are singled out for disproportionate conscription in Putin's military draft system. So those are people that we can potentially reach out to as well, in addition to ethnic Russians who are more liberal in orientation and unsympathetic to Putin's regime.
Thank you very much. And let me remind our viewers that, of course, in Putin's Russia ideology right now is not coming from honest discussions like ours. It comes from TV propaganda, which is little known to the Western audience. But if you look a little bit into it, into Russia Today channel and others, you'll be very surprised at what you hear and see. Len Deutsch, please, Dr. Deutsch.
Okay. Hi. I associate patriotism, as opposed to nationalism, patriotism with support for and admiration of the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights and the other amendments, whereas I see nationalism as akin to, or at least associated with, exceptionalism, which then suggests that people in other countries are unexceptional, which I think they would find insulting. Also, the silo mentality of nationalism, we can do it alone, which overlooks the fact that we are interrelated in many ways, and solving problems like climate change will depend upon cooperation. I did have a question. I don't know very much at all about Noam Chomsky or Cornel West. You indicated that they hate him, the United States. Is that based upon anything they said explicitly, or something to be inferred either from their actions or from something they've written?
I think it's both. It's both inferable and and evident from things they've said. They have both said, and have said this for many years, that the U.S. is the worst and most dangerous power in the world. That has been Chomsky's consistent line for decades. Chomsky even said that it was a bad thing that the Berlin Wall fell or the communism fell because it strengthened the power of the U.S. Similarly, Cornel West has expressed similar sentiments at various times. I think also there is an inference to be drawn from the fact that they express sympathy for virtually every anti-American movement of every kind anywhere in the world that arises during their politically active lifetimes. On the issue of exceptionalism and nationalism, it's interesting that you put it that way, in that usually American exceptionalism is thought of as the idea that America is unusual because it's a nation based on universal liberal ideals, whereas most nations are based on a particular race or ethnicity or culture. Obviously, if you want to use the term exceptionalism in a different way, that's fine, like nationalism and patriotism. It's a somewhat slippery term, that different people can understand differently. Certainly, one traditional understanding of American patriotism is the idea, that America is good or even great because of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which of course exemplify the liberal universalism that I was talking about. But obviously, other people have other understandings of American patriotism, and in particular, more nationalistic Americans, both in earlier eras mentioned by Professor McAllister and today. They have their understanding of American patriotism is it should be more like that of European nationalism, more focused on a particular culture, ethnicity, or religion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. Dr. McAllister, another question, please.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit, and you've hinted at what you think, but just think a little bit about if we don't go ahead and aid Ukraine, if the West loses its will and Russia is able to win, what do you think the outcome is going to be on the rules-based international order, on what we built, versus if Ukraine is able to win? And I mean, you can define win however you want. I know that's hard.
Sure.
But what do the two futures look like to you?
So certainly, I don't think it's difficult to see that from a standpoint of Western liberalism and the international order, things are better if Ukraine prevails in some kind of way than if Russia prevails, both because Russia's relative power will be great in a sort of greater in a hard power sort of sense. They will have eliminated the Ukrainian opponent and can focus their attention elsewhere, but also because nationalist movements, really political movements generally, but especially nationalist movements, gain momentum and prestige from winning on the battlefield. I do not believe that, if Russia wins in Ukraine, that means, the struggle for the world is completely over. This struggle with Russia and China could potentially go on for some time, and losing one battle, well, it would be fatal and horrible for Ukraine. It wouldn't necessarily be fatal overall, just like defeat in Vietnam didn't mean that the Soviet Union won the entire Cold War. And there were other setbacks during the Cold War as well, but we did eventually win. But I think if we are able to prevail in Ukraine, that will certainly give us a boost. It will make it more likely that the Putinist threat can be squelched before it gets going further, because Putin's regime will be weaker. It will increase the chance that his successor might pursue different policies. It will also increase the chance, though it won't be certain by any means, but it'll increase the chance that his regime might fall entirely and be replaced by something better. And also the Western sympathizers of Putin would lose heart to some extent, especially to the extent that some of their admiration for him and his government depends on the image of strength that he tries to project. As you say, there are different definitions of what counts as a Ukrainian victory or a Russian victory for that matter. But I think the effects that I mentioned in either direction would be greater the scope of the victory. And similarly, if there's an outcome that most people regard as a sort of stalemate, which certainly could happen, then you would also see an in-between outcome along these other dimensions as well.
Yeah, one thing I would add, look, and it goes back to what I studied in graduate school, and I think if the world loses faith in the United States' willingness to lead, it brings into question the American nuclear umbrella, and I think we're entering a new period of nuclear proliferation. I think we're already the hopes for where we've seen a huge reduction in number of nuclear weapons since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but now, especially if people lose faith, with arms control already in trouble. I mean, Putin's already announced his intention to pull out a new START. If people lose faith in the American nuclear umbrella, you could see, and I think it was the Polish prime minister the other day that actually talked about this, that Poland would have to explore the idea of building nuclear weapons. And then you could really open up Pandora's box.
Yeah, so these are certainly broader issues, some of them beyond my expertise, but overall, I think it is clear that the situation in the international system would be worse if Russia is able to prevail. I do have to leave within, unfortunately, another minute or two, because we were supposed to end at the hour. So I don't know if we want to finish up in some way, or if somebody has a last word.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilya. We have been here for an hour, and we're about to end this wonderful conversation. Thank you once again for coming, and we all wish for fast resolution. It has been 10 years these days since Russia started annexation of Crimea, and in earnest, the Ukrainian war lasts for 10 years, 2 years of intensive full-scale phase. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and we have greetings to all of our viewers, including, first of all, those in Ukraine. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.